Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker. Most of us don't need to make speeches, we need to make friends. We don't need to march down Main Street, we need to march over to our neighbor's house and have dinner. This is the core message of Black and White, that racism can be disrupted by relationship. It can be defeated by forming friendships with people who don't look like we do. Friendship with someone from a different racial background changes us. It gives racism one less foothold in the world. This new book, Black and White, suggests that for 21st century American Christians, working against racism is part of what it means to call Jesus Lord and Savior. John Hambrick earned a Bachelor of Arts degree at Pepperdine University and completed his Master's in Divinity from Fuller Theological Seminary and a doctorate degree from Columbia Seminary. Since 2004, he served at Buckhead Church, the urban campus of North Point Ministries, where he met and began to work with co-author Teesha Hadra. Teesha possesses an undergraduate degrees in psychology and criminology, as well as a Juris Doctor, all from the University of Florida. She practiced law for nearly 7 years before leaving to begin full-time ministry in 2013 at Buckhead Church in Atlanta. In 2016, she began working on a Master's of Divinity at Fuller Theological, where she also works on a grant project involving innovation and vocation. Here to discuss their new book, Black and White, Disrupting Racism, One Friendship at a Time, are Teesha Hadra and John Hambrick. Welcome to Revealing the Truth.
Thank you. We're glad to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Glad to have you here. So the two of you come from a obviously diverse background.
We've been told that before.
Yeah, the biggest diversity.
What you mean by that, obviously.
The biggest diversity is, and the most obvious is, one, you studied in California and you studied in Florida.
That's right.
That is
right.
Wow. Okay, that may be the
diversity that I see between the two of you as a talk show host. And that
we were hoping that wouldn't come.
That is almost an insurmountable divide.
Absolutely.
That's true. We haven't figured out. We can talk about racial things and gender things, but we can't talk about that yet. It's a tender topic for us.
The two coasts, it's pretty touchy.
Yeah,
pretty touchy stuff.
So thanks for bringing it.
And me being a minister, I'm sensitive to that, and so we're not going to try to do any reconciliation today between the California attitudes and the Florida attitudes.
Thank goodness.
Okay, well,
I'm so glad.
I'm a little disappointed. We were hoping you could help us out, but we'll pass.
It's so controversial, and the scriptural references are so numerous that I would take up the whole program. You wouldn't have an opportunity to speak. I want to get away from that. So, Teesha, let's start with you. Did you grow up in Florida?
Sure. I did. I grew up in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. My parents, my family, though, are all from Jamaica and have mostly since emigrated now to the United States. And family is still right there in Fort Lauderdale. Yeah, even though I'm out in Los Angeles now.
So they sold out.
Yeah. But they still bring all the lovely food and lovely accents all here down to South Florida. So we still get to enjoy lots of that.
Wonderful. So did you grow up in a family of faith? Were you raised in the church? Was this something that you found different here than your Jamaican roots?
Yeah, so I was born here in the United States, and my immediate family was not church going, but my extended family is largely Christian. So I grew up kind of going to church on the holidays, Easter, perhaps Christmas. But really, like most people spend summers at their grandparents' house. I did that too. It's just that my grandmother lived in Jamaica. So I would spend summers there. And so when I was with her, we would go to church every Sunday and go to vacation Bible school like good Baptist. So that was most of my exposure to the Christian faith was through my grandmother. And I didn't become a Christian until I was somewhere in my mid-20s.
Okay. And John, what was your experience?
So my maternal grandparents were very committed believers, and I think they had a profound influence on me growing up.
Thank goodness for grandparents.
That's right. That's right. My mom and dad, I think they believed. Church was, I think our relationship spiritually was somewhat a side note to our family. But I think we spent a lot of Sundays in church, and when I really started to follow Christ closely, they were nothing but supportive. Mm-hmm. And of course, as you already mentioned, I grew up in Southern California, third generation Southern Californian.
Okay. When you take a look at the environment that you grew up in, Teesha, you grew up in a very interesting city of Fort Lauderdale, heavily Jewish influence, very large Jewish community in Fort Lauderdale, diverse community, but island diverse, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, more of the Latin diversity. So your identity was being shaped. How was your identity shaped as a child, and what were your experiences in school from just from the shaping of your identity?
Yeah, it's interesting. Growing up in Fort Lauderdale, I went to my fair share of bat mitzvahs, bar mitzvahs, and quinceañeras, all of the above. Growing up in just a diverse part of the country, as you said, it's an incredible mixture of different cultures and races right there. And so I'm really very thankful for that experience, because what it kind of taught me from a very early age was how to exist and also appreciate being in ethnically and racially diverse environments. But interestingly enough, for example, when I was in high school, I was on the debate team, and my high school was in Fort Lauderdale, was a very diverse public high school. And so I was on the debate team, which everyone can make their assumptions about my nerdiness based on that. And I'm fine with it. I've come to terms with it. So I was this debater. And when we would go away to competitions, more often than not, my school's team was the most diverse. Most of the people of color, whether Black or Latino, Asian, etc., were from my high school, and all the other teams were predominantly white. And so even though I was in this very diverse, almost like a bubble in a sense, sometimes we would go to other places and really discover that even other places within Florida, even other high schools, that was not the same everywhere, And so it was something that I learned not to take for granted, but to appreciate and value.
Teesha, I want to ask you a very bold and direct question.
Sure.
An assumption would be made from a visual perspective that you would be dealt with as an African American.
That's right.
Which is quite stereotypical. Does not allow even for the narrative of expansion within that everyone who is of dark complexion is an African American. And so how did you, with your Jamaican roots, your island roots, was there anything for you to overcome in that? Was that something you had to address? Was this something that did you find within your sphere of peers of color, was there within that sphere a tinge of racism within that identity?
That's such a good question. And as in writing the book and in just thinking about this topic and reflecting on my own time growing up, I noticed, or I realized that my parents, my mom, realized that I would be perceived in although she comes from a country that's predominantly black, most people are black, that we were now in the United States, and that her children would be brought up in this environment where the cultural context, the texture of the place would be very different from the one that she grew up in. And so she took some really specific steps to be sure that we were aware of the history of African Americans in the United States, that we perceived ourselves as beautiful, that our hair, our kinky curly hair was beautiful, that our skin was beautiful, even small things like we were a part of the local urban league in our community, which meant that we were learning about, I participated in, I remember like an African American history, like Jeopardy game show where I had to learn all of these amazing figures that were part of Black American history, so that we were always knew that that was something that we were going to have to contend with as we were growing up, that we were not in Jamaica, that we were here in the United States and would need to go about our lives aware of the particularities of the history of this place. And I'm very thankful that she raised us with that awareness. And I've not asked her, I don't know where the wherewithal to do that came from, but I think it was a very astute choice in her parenting. To know that she was going to have to combat a different thing with both of her daughters. Yeah. So, yeah.
Well, it's a level of wisdom that I'm really stunned by, because it is so insightful. And I can see, had you not been prepared, had you not had this attitude, there could be an assimilation and listen, I come from a people that have had to assimilate. From a culture of Judaism throughout Eastern Europe, where my family is from, into assimilating into an American culture, and even having changed our name from Vovovich to Walker, so that my father could assimilate into American society without being discriminated against as a Hungarian Jew. So I'm very familiar with this, and so I appreciate that. John, I'm more intimately aware with your background. I lived in Diamond Bar for 7 years, and so I was part of the California culture. And California is probably the most ethnically diverse state in the United States,
Right.
from much more so than I think we find a much larger Asian population within California. We find many different influences and many different cultures. So it really is quite a melting pot. And the issue within California is mostly gang related in the urban areas. In the rural, and I consider Diamond Bar and Malibu as being, yes, they're urban, but they're really rural compared to Compton or compared to Oakland. Um,
True. That's true.
and that kind of in helping people in our audience, which is a global audience, understand some of the dynamic differences between Los Angeles. Los Angeles is a large, sprawling metropolis, but made up of many areas that aren't really rural, but they're not really urban either. They're suburban, but they, in the context of Middle Eastern cultures or in other cultures, there are things that are unique to California in the racial conflict, and there's a great history going all the way back to both World War I, World War II, and many of the migration and immigration issues that we're facing today and challenges that we're facing today in America are alive and ripe and well existing in California.
That's true. Very true.
So how were you prepared? Was there in your lifetime, and you and I are pretty close in age, I remember segregation, and I remember integration, and I remember um, lagging behind because Jewish and anti-Semitism outlasted. We were still a part of a segregated group until the 70s, when we were finally able to join, late 70s, early 80s, till we could finally join certain country clubs and be participants in certain civic organizations which
Right.
we had been previously excluded from. Did you have any experiences with diversity or with racism in California in your upbringing?
Well, it depends. So I'm 65, and so I was born in Burbank, which is part of Metro Los Angeles, and I eventually moved. My family moved to Ventura, which is on the beach, an hour north of Los Angeles. But for the up through about third grade, I was living in Reseda, which is in the San Fernando Valley, and it was a very ethnically speaking, it was a very isolated context. So almost all the kids in my school, Calvert Elementary School, were white. Not all, but almost all. Certainly everybody in my church was white. Everybody in our neighborhood was white, although we lived across the street from a Jewish family, the Gams. I still remember that. Even though the Watts riots, which occurred when I was probably about 10 or so, were, as the crow flies, maybe only about 25, 30 miles away, it might as well have been in another universe. And so and my parents were wonderful people, but so I did not grow up in a racist family by any means, but I grew up in a family that, ethnically speaking, was very isolated. And so it took me a long time to get past the sense that all these things that were going on, the civil rights movement, the Watts riots, and all the other things, it took me a long time to get past the idea that that has nothing to do with me.
You know, I'm a couple years older than you, and so
But you have a lot more hair than I do, so I think that kind of evens things out.
well, I actually cause people to pull their hair out. So,
Lose hair. Okay, well, somebody beat you to it in my case, so I think we'll be fine.
So I'm a carrier. You know, it's interesting because my experience as a Jewish believer, and I came to faith at age 44, brings another dimension to this, because as I was introduced to Christianity and to the church, I found that the church was racist. I found that the church, and there were things I didn't understand. As a matter of fact, we did a special right after the third debate of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And during that debate was the first reference specifically to the black church. And so I'm in Birmingham, Alabama. And so I called leaders of the Black History Museum here, Civil Rights Museum here, and leaders of the church to come in and do a special so that I could understand why a discussion of two presidential candidates about the black church was not advancing a racial divide. Because I knew nothing about the history of the black church and the role of the black church, and that why there would be a distinction made that there was such a thing as the black church and that this was okay. Because I wasn't trained in Christianity. I'm raised Jewish. I live as a Jew. I'll die as a Jew, and I have a Jewish Messiah. So for me, it was very foreign. So I surrounded myself with leaders of the black community to explain and to educate to me and the audience, because I know that millions of people listened to this and had no idea what they were talking about when they referred to this quote unquote the black church. And so I thought, I was troubled by this. I said, this is just advancing from the podium of a presidential debate, racism, and saying it's fine to have a racially divided church, and not understanding the role of the black church, especially here in the South. So I got a huge education. Our audience, we did a 3-hour special because if it bothers me, the audience is going to hear about it. It's like when I'm in the pulpit of a congregation, or when I led a congregation, if it bothered me, my congregation was going to hear about it. I was going to preach about it if it troubled me in the scriptures, or it was something going on in life that was burdensome to me. It was going to be burdensome to them because I was going to share it. And so we did a 3-hour special on this because I wanted to understand why this wasn't advancing at the highest level of office, a racially divided church. And it caused me to do a very deep dive into Scripture to understand that there was no such thing as basically races. There was no such thing as races in the Bible. That there are only two people, and it's confirmed in Ephesians 2, that the only two people of the Bible were Jews and Gentiles. And that in Ephesians 2, God says, and from the two I shall make one new man. This is in Messiah, and so all believers are unified. There's no longer Jew or Gentile, male or female, Jew or Greek. Now we are one in Messiah. The dividing wall of partition, which in the natural would have been the view that Jesus had when he preached in the temple, was that the men were separated from the women, and the Jews were separated from the Gentiles that were relegated to the court of the Gentiles. It didn't matter what color your skin was. As a matter of fact, the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and we look in Acts chapter 2, and we see that they were praying in languages, and the people gathered and heard in their own language. And when you look at the languages and the places that all these Jewish people came from, they came from a diverse diaspora, okay, of areas where they were divided by language, but they were speaking in their own language. Some of those languages were African languages. Remember, Israel is Asia, south is Egypt, that's Africa. So it's right there as a land bridge between Europe, Asia, and Africa. And so when we were dispersed, these nations coming back for the pilgrimage, we heard in this language. So you would have an Ethiopian Jew, tall, black, standing next to a European, maybe one from Damascus, or one from Greece, or from Turkey, that was, 5'9", and red hair. So diversity within the Jewish world, from an ethnicity, there was no, you were Jewish or you were Gentile. That was all there was in the Bible. So the Greeks gave us this idea of ethnos, which we can now call ethnic, and this is where the races and where the idea of the perfect person and ethnic cleansing, and where the thought processes of the Hitlers and of the Ahmadinejads and the people that would advance the creation of a perfect race and trying to establish these ideals. And this has been carried through in modern history, but not through the Bible. And it's a clear distinction we have to make. And I think you do an amazing job in addressing the issue, and how, like salvation, each one of us must do this one person at a time. We're talking with Teesha Hadra and John Hambrick, authors of Black, White, Disrupting Racism, One Friendship at a Time. If you don't understand, like I don't understand, why you don't understand that every person you talk to is created in the image of God. We're not talking about an external image, we're talking about an internal image. We're talking about the heart. We're talking about the spirit. My spirit recognizes your spirit. We are called to walk by faith and not by sight, that man looks on the outward appearance, God looks at the heart, and therefore if we are to be God-centered, we are to look at the heart of the person we're dealing with, and whatever we say to that person, however we treat that person, we are treating God himself, because he's the one that created that person. And therefore we should withhold nothing from anyone for any reason whatsoever. For who were you and who was I before we accepted the sacrifice that was made for us to be able to enter in the kingdom of heaven and become a part of the family of God. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to dig into some of the discoveries, some of the concepts, and some of the great counsel that these two very strong believers have taken the time to put together for your benefit so that we can fight racism all throughout the world, one person at a time. We'll be right back. Not everything that makes the headlines has biblical importance, but many events that happen around the world do, and you never hear about them. Igniting a Nation is pleased to teach Revealing Prophecy every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. at the Marriott 280 in Birmingham. We will cover worldwide events and insider information that will connect the dots of what's happening around the world with biblical prophecy. If you happen to miss a class, we'll televise each week's class at 10 o'clock Central Time on ignitinganation.com and all our social media outlets. Copies of the teachings will also be available to purchase on our website at www.ignitinganation.com. The Lord meets you right where you are, and so does Igniting a Nation's new live streaming outlets. You can now watch Revealing the Truth, Revealing the Bible, and Prophecy Revealed simulcast live each Monday through Friday from 10 a.m. to 1 o'clock p.m. Central Standard Time on YouTube Live, Facebook Live, Vimeo, Periscope, and through our website, www.ignitinganation.com. No matter what device you are using, our program will automatically scale so you won't have to miss a single program. And if you happen to miss an episode, you can always subscribe to the Igniting a Nation YouTube channel and access over 1,000 interviews and never miss your favorite authors, special guests, and topics that interest you the most.
There are lots of ways to see Israel, but nothing compares to seeing the land of the book and the people of the book through the eyes of two Jewish believers who can take you on a journey that will bring the entire Bible to life. When you join Rabbi Eric Walker and his #1 rated tour guide, Edo Canaan, in Israel, you'll experience incredible teachings, first-class accommodations, and actually walk where Jesus walked. You will experience the Bible transforming from black and white into living color, and you will never see the Bible in the same way again. For more information, visit us at www.ignitinganation.com/events.
The Lord contends with what contends with you, and Igniting a Nation is committed to bringing to light each and every issue that faces a believer's life. Our live stream programming and teachings take you on a journey to finding biblical truth from a wide variety of experts who share their insights into a deeper walk with the Lord. We have assembled the most comprehensive panel of experts in the fields of prophecy, caregiving, healing from trauma, shame, and abuse, and so much more. We continue to expand our teachings and programming to meet your needs. We're committed to healing the nations with biblical truth. Visit www.ignitinganation.com to develop a deeper walk with the Lord and start your journey to a transformed life. The Bible commands us to study to show ourselves approved, but most study using Bible study tools and not actually studying the Bible chapter and verse. Igniting a Nation is pleased to present Revealing the Bible, recorded and taught each week before a live audience. We take you deeper into the actual Bible and verse in both Hebrew and English and connect the dots between the Old and New Testament. You can attend our 2 classes in Tuscaloosa and Birmingham, or watch the program every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Central Time on ignitinganation.com and all our other simulcast outlets. For more information, visit www.ignitinganation.com/events. Shalom and welcome back to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and we're talking with Teesha Hadra and John Hambrick, authors of the newly released book, Black, White, Disrupting Racism, One Friendship at a Time. Teesha and John, welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
So this concept of black and white, engaging in disrupting racism one friendship at a time. Tell me where this premise came into play, how you developed this, Teesha, and how you and John decided to collaborate in this project.
Yeah, so the foundational message of the book is that friendships, by which we mean deep relationships characterized by mutuality, by respect, by love, is the foundational work that's necessary for us to then begin to do the extra step of addressing or working to disrupt systemic and structural racism. So that's sort of the foundational message of the book. And it's funny because John and I did not sort of think this up independently and then say, hey, do you want to become friends so that we can write a book about racism and friendship? We were good friends for years before this idea, and it was John's idea initially, ever came up. So we met when I came on staff at Buckhead Church, where John is still on staff as a pastor. And we met in John's office, which is sort of a fun place for us because in John's office is where we first met. It's also where I got engaged. My husband colluded with John to propose to me, and then John officiated our wedding. So John and I are and were really good friends before, we ever sort of had this idea to write the book.
So in this collaboration, because you had developed this friendship, what was the burning issue that caused you to think that there is a solution, and the solution, John, is to disrupt? The disruption is the operative, this is the action word, is to disrupt racism, not to defeat, not to replace, not to eliminate, but to disrupt it.
That's true. And it's, we came up with that idea thinking about my experience. So as you heard me say a few minutes ago, I grew up in a fairly racially isolated suburb. And while all these things, because of my age, were going on in our country, the civil rights movement, the Watts riots, and things of that nature, I didn't. Here's the way I phrase it. I did not care about black people until I began to care about a black person. And you'll recall in my story, the chapter about my story, which is entitled, I Once Was Blind and Now I'm Just Kind of Nearsighted, referencing the idea that I'm still figuring all this out. I mentioned that for me, the point of transition was I started to become friends with a black guy at Pepperdine University, which is where I went to undergrad in Malibu, as you talked about earlier. And as I got to, his name was Bobby, as I got to know Bobby better and saw some of the pain that was inevitably connected with being a black person in Southern California, because I cared about Bobby, I started to care about that. And I wish I could tell you that from that point on, I was just committed to that. I was not. It took a long time and several experiences and several encounters with other people of other races before I really started to realize that for me, part of what it means to call Jesus Lord and Savior is to be involved in disrupting racism. But the reason we have that thesis is because that's been my, and I think our experience.
Yeah.
John, I grew up in Pittsburgh, born there in 1952. And at the age of 8 years old, walking to the elementary school, I walked every day, met at the corner a little girl named Regina Jones. And she and I would hold hands at 8 years old and walk to school every day. I would stop and make sure that she crossed okay. And my mother told me that this was just fine. And so we walked, all the kids on our street, congregated at the bottom of the street. And then kids would merge with us, and we would all walk because it was local. It was, the elementary school was just a couple blocks up the road, and I befriended. My best friend was little Regina Jones, that looked completely different than I did, and I will always remember that we had we had Rush. I lived in an all Jewish street, but surrounded by an all Catholic neighborhood. So you had different cultural. We also, within the Jewish community, I was a Hungarian Jew living across the street from a Russian Jew who lived next door to a Polish Jew who lived next door to a German Jew who lived around the corner from a Lithuanian Jew who lived around the corner from another Russian Jew. So we had all this ethnic melting pot, and then you had Regina Jones who lived a little bit further down the street, and intermixed in were many different racially Polish families and Hungarian families and Slavic families, and we were just a melting pot. And I didn't know anything about racism. I only knew that I was called the Christ killer. That was the only thing I ever knew, and that's what the Catholic kids called me and the other Jewish kids, because that was the mantra of the Catholic Church at the time in the 50s, 60s until the 70s, were that the Jews killed Christ. So for 1800 years, this was a myth that was perpetuated against the Jews by the Catholic Church, and it was a message carried on, and we were a large Jewish community. So I didn't know about racism. I didn't, and so I almost feel like I was in this bubble where all these things about civil rights and integration and all this stuff, I had no concept of it because we were integrated. We had a neighborhood where it was multicultural, it was multiracial, it was not on my little tiny street, but there were only like 11 or 12 houses on my little tiny street. But the larger street, there was everybody from everywhere and from every country. So I never knew about it until I came to the South. And in the South, I came in 1975, was when I first came up against what I would consider to be real racism. And I went to Penn State University, a very large university, 55,000 students, and it was during the 60s and 70s, and so we had the Black Panthers and Angela Davis, and you had various, but Bobby Seals and all these things that were going on at that time, but there still wasn't an issue of racism that I could understand. So I've never, and maybe because it's ethnically, I'm on this side of anti-Semitism and discrimination, and the fact that I've been a recipient of it, that I can't understand it. I can't even fathom, especially as a believer in Christianity, that there can be such a thing as a Christian racist. I can't even conceive of it. That's how hard it is for me to understand. But I know that it exists because I've seen it. I've seen it firsthand. And it's so disturbing to me. It is so anti-Christian. It is so antithetical to the Bible. It's so anti-Jesus that it breaks my heart. But I'm so thankful that two of you have approached this in the manner in which you have, which is edifying and encouraging, that it begins with loving a person before you can love a people.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
That's right.
So how do we do this? Now we've established the need to do it, so let's go to a little bit of instruction. We don't want to tell them everything, not all of the secret sauce of the book, but we do want to give them some kind of guidance into what areas you cover and what are some of the topical areas. So John, walk me through just a little bit of some of the areas that you cover in the book.
Well, we cover quite a few. I mean, we spend a good amount of time, we tell our stories. Mm-hmm. We spend a good amount of time talking about a relational approach to disrupting racism. We also talk about the systemic racism that continues to characterize our culture. And our contention is the work of disrupting racism starts with relationships, but it doesn't stop with relationships. And we think as more and more people begin to care about each other, people who don't look like each other, we might begin to figure out what so far has been a fairly confusing situation regarding some of the systemic components of racism that exist in our country. We also, so there's a lot of that. We also include a chapter on what we feel to be the participation of principalities and power in racism. We feel like, well, obviously it is sustained and that a racist agenda is put forward by human beings. We think there are other beings involved, and we take some time to talk about that. And the reason we do is because we think if you don't understand that, you will be bringing the equivalent of a spray bottle to a house fire. And so if there are principalities and powers involved in sustaining racism, it's very important that we're cognizant of that so that we can combat that appropriately.
So let me stop you right there, because I think this is a brilliant nugget that says that Paul writes very clearly that our battle is not against flesh and blood. So our battle is not against the color of your skin, Teesha, or John, your skin, or the color of my skin. This is a battle against principalities and a spiritual battle of division. And that the accuser of the brethren, the enemy of man, not the enemy of God, Satan by his own name, Hasatan in the Hebrew, the accuser is his name, he is the accuser, the father of lies, would come and perpetuate this concept, so much so that you may not even be aware that when Persia changed its name to Iran, that it changed its name to Iran because in Arabic, Iran translates Aryan. This was done as a sympathizer to the Nazi agenda of ethnic cleansing of a superior race, but in the Ayatollah's mind, the superior race was a Shiite Muslim, not a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant of the Aryan, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Adolf Hitler type of description. And so that's the depth of division that is being perpetuated throughout the world in this ethnic divide, which was, we know that the Greeks had mythology and false gods and Pan, which is the most prominent. This is the one that Jesus stood right there. He said, "Today I stand before you at the gate, and the gates of hell will not prevail." He stood there in Pan's temple, right there at a place called Banyas in Caesarea Philippi in Israel. And he says, "And on this rock I will build my church." He's talking to Peter in this place. And this is the place where they're dropping human sacrifices and animal sacrifice through a hole in the ground to the false god, Greek god Pan, the author of Panic and Pandemonium and panic attacks and all these things, fear. And so this division is perpetuated, and it is demonic that if you can divide the body, then what happened at Babel when God said, if these people do this in one accord, nothing will be impossible for them. If the body of Christ were unified, and instead of being one light, we were compounded and we became 2.5 billion candle power as one unified body, it would be a light that the world could not resist. It explains very clearly that this is a demonic division and a principality, and it's a place that Satan has set himself up and been very effective, by the way, at dividing people based on racial divides. So I think that's a brilliant account. So what can we do? I think first of all, by stating that, we shed a great deal of light into something that's been hidden in darkness now for a long time. What else can we do?
Well, I think the notion or realization that we are dealing with principalities and powers has to impact our thinking and our action in a couple of ways. I mean, one, we can't allow that reality to obscure the role of people in the carrying on of racism and racist policies and practices. So we still have to be able to see that people have accountability and will be culpable for their actions. But it also means that we cannot begin to, whether it's through relationships or in whatever path we choose, we can't set out on that path without prayer. I think that that's so easy to overlook, even for believers, the role of prayer in addressing matters of racism and racial injustice.
Yeah, it's like I said, to not take that on board is like bringing a spray bottle to a house fire. I mean, the intentions may be good, but you're woefully underpowered to fight the problem.
And the Psalms are an incredible place to draw from in crying out to God. I can't remember if it's 82 or 83 where the psalmist says, rise up, oh God. That the Psalms give us the words to put around our cries for justice, whether it's for ourselves or on behalf of our brothers and sisters who are on the receiving end of racist policies or of racism. And so, right at our fingertips, we have these ancient words that people have been praying for, thousands of years to enable us to bring these things to God in an authentic and an honest, in a raw, in a real way. And these are not, I don't have to tell you, I'm sure these are not prayers that are full of euphemisms. A friend of mine likes to say that it's like your opportunity to get to shake your fist at God and say, God, do you see this? Are you paying attention? We need you to break in and do something about this. So we have these incredible tools in the Psalms or the Book of Lamentations, for example, that will enable us to name the injustice that we see and give those things over to God.
Racism is a learned behavior.
Mm-hmm.
It's passed from generation to generation, and it's time to stop. The Bible says, train up a child in the way they should go, and when they grow older, they will not depart from it. So it does begin in the home. And there is a conversation, a narrative to have with children. How important is that in this whole process?
It's absolutely crucial. One of the stories we begin with in the book talks about the guy who eventually became the sheriff in Dallas when all those police officers were shot and killed several years ago. And the reason he had such a powerful prophetic response to that was because he had, when he was a little boy, been invited over. He was a black man. He was invited over to a white family's house for dinner. And he cites that as being foundational in his understanding of why racism is evil, but equally of importance is how racism can be overcome. And so, yeah, starting when the babies, when kids are little is crucial. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think, John, you raised a good point about as people engage what we write about in the book, that's they're modeling that then for their children, for their children's children, for their friends' children, what this looks like. And so it's not just about sort of what people say to their kids, although that is important, but how they live their lives and the example that they are setting. Children will remember those experiences and then be able to draw on them later and be shaped by that along the way.
Is there any risk in being intentional about this? Is there too overt? Is there too much? A false balance is an abomination of God. How intentional should I be in pursuing? John, you talk about you can't love a people unless you love a person. How much should I go out and try and make this happen or show interest? How do I do that?
Well, I think you bring up something very important. And I was having dinner with one of the pastors of a very big church, and the dinner occurred up in Nashville a year or two ago. And this person was saying, we just need to focus on the gospel. And these things about racism and stuff, while they're not unimportant, they're kind of distractions. And we were having dinner. There were several people at the table, and I chose not to I disagree with him at that point, but I've thought a lot about that conversation in the ensuing months. And I realized that he was preaching a very tiny gospel. Mm-hmm. He was preaching a gospel that had almost nothing to do with the realities that most non-Christians inhabit. Mm-hmm. And so and in fact, he made the gospel so small that people out in our culture can't see it. And so as Teesha and I have thought and worked and prayed and written and spoken about this, we want to be people who talk about a big gospel, a gospel the size of the gospel that Jesus and Paul preached, and that it becomes obvious that this gospel, yes, it's all about and it's focused on the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, but it has implications for all of life. Mm-hmm. And it certainly has significant implications for this battle against racism. So, yes, that's why we frame this as clear. We try to be as clear as we did. That for us, part of what it means for us to call Jesus Lord is to engage in the battle to disrupt racism.
We've been talking with Teesha Hadra and John Hambrick, authors of Black and White: Disrupting Racism, One Friendship at a Time. This is a spiritual battle, my friends, and one we have to enter into. And we need to win hearts one at a time. As John so eloquently said, you can't love a people unless you love a person first. And we need to disrupt this pattern of racism and not talk about racial reconciliation with the entire world, but let's begin at home in your neighborhood. Let's begin with somebody whose car you see parked in their driveway when you're backing out on Sunday morning and their car's still in the driveway, and you realize that they might not have a church home, and you stop your car and go knock on their door, knowing that they are the new African American family, or the new Chinese family, or the new whatever their ethnic background is, and maybe they haven't been settled, and it's going to start with you. It's no different than the prayer that praying for change. Lord, let there be change, but let it begin with me. And so you can help join the battle to disrupt racism one friendship at a time by getting a copy of this book by Teesha Hadra and John Hambrick, Black and White: Disrupting Racism, One Friendship at a Time. Teesha and John, thank you. Thank you for this work, and thank you for sharing it with us here on Revealing the Truth.
Thanks for having us today.
Yes, thanks so much. It was a pleasure.
God bless you. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.